Hi, and welcome to episode 68 of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. I just got distracted immediately because the Red Wings just tied it at 2.
Nice.
Because they're playing Chicago. We are here. Today's going to be a Mead day. So that's going to be exciting. To start, I have John's Homebrew and Wine Supply.
Not a sponsor, but
Not a sponsor.
We're open.
That's where I get my honey. And here is my honey that I'm going to be using today. John throws his little logo on everything. Sam, what's mead? We'll take that
Mead.
as like a basic question to start us off.
What is mead? Are you quizzing me? You can quiz me. That'd be fun. What do I know about mead? What does Sam know about mead?
What is mead?
Mead is fermented honey, basically. It is alcohol using the sugar of honey. It originated probably one of the oldest, if not, it's probably up there with beer as one of the oldest alcoholic beverages made by human beings.
I think mead has been determined to be the oldest fermented beverage by humans because it was discovered apparently accidentally. Like wild honey fermented. People figured out that it got them buzzed, and then they figured out how to make it on their own.
So really, the base ingredients are really just honey and water. That's
yeast.
Plus wild yeast or modernly cultivated yeast. That would give you mead. But there's been, especially recently, and maybe there's some of this is, historic recipes and things like that. But there's just been an explosion in mead, maybe in partly in response to some of the gluten stuff, or just diversification in spirits. And now you can do all sorts of mead flavoring. So I think you gave us a preview on other podcasts about the types of mead that you have. So you can get pretty fancy. It's evolved far beyond just honey and water.
I just bottled 3 gallons that I had fermenting for quite a while. That's my strawberry, which is this right here.
Yeah.
I have a traditional that's in little beer bottles over there, and too far away, but my blackberry, which I'm currently drinking. The problem with bottling your own mead is that you tend to drink it as you are bottling. But I've been doing this for a couple years now, and I started because of my gluten thing that I've got going on. You turn late 20s and then your body starts to quit. And I decided I wanted to make something that would be a fun hobby to produce things, but then be fun to make as well, so that I could actually drink. So we are going to, today, we're going to get our mead into what we call primary fermentation. So that's when you mix the honey and water together. It's called your must, M-U-S-T. And then we will add a couple of the different spices. And I think the juniper berry mead is the one that won on our poll. So that is hibiscus flowers, some dried whole juniper berries, and yarrow flower. So these are going to be our 3 ingredients today. And there's timing for when you add certain ingredients, whether you put it into primary fermentation or secondary fermentation. Primary lasts about 2 weeks. That's when your yeast is the most active, breaking down the sugars in the honey. And then after about 2-3 weeks, you'll notice this is my cranberry that I currently have fermenting, your airlock up top. And so this is still in primary fermentation. It hasn't moved into secondary yet. Your airlock will stop bubbling. That means that the sugars being eaten by the yeast, there's no carbon dioxide being produced. So your airlock should be kind of stable.
Does that mean that the yeast has started to die too, because its food source is basically going away?
Partially. And you can see that in the bottom of this little jar. All of that sediment on the bottom is a mixture of dead yeast, bits of fruit that have kind of fallen down, all of that kind of stuff.
And the yeast that you use, this is commercial yeast, specifically raised and bred for mead making, or is this kind of like baker's yeast? just
This
off
is
the shelf?
wine yeast.
Wine
Yeah.
yeast. Okay. Okay.
All of which you can buy at your local homebrew store. It's usually kept, well, it should be kept in a refrigerator. That's where you can find it. It needs to be cold until you kind of reactivate it. So in a little bit, you'll see me. I think I have 71B, which is the strain that I like to use for my mead. And I will add it to it's like a half ounce to an ounce of water that's roughly 100 degrees in the
Mm.
90s. And then it sits in that water for about 20 minutes and then comes back to life. And then I pour it into the must, or the
The
mixture of honey and water.
the water that you use, this is not tap water, correct? This is distilled
No,
or bottled water,
spring water.
spring water.
And this is just your basic, this is my local store. So if you were at like a Fred Meyer, it'd be like your Kroger brand, or Meyer in Michigan and Midwest. It'd just be like your generic brand spring water.
The
Uh,
idea being that tap water in most places will have chlorine, fluoride, some sort of additives that's going to kill the yeast. It's going to break down your fermentation process, and you're
yeah.
going to be left with nothing, basically, just a
Yeah.
bunch of
So what we
stuff
would
floating.
call stalled fermentation, which is
Mm.
what you don't want. So your yeast don't multiply like they should. The sugars aren't broken down in an ideal way. And then, yeah, so your fermentation would stall. And in that case, uh, you could attempt again with a different strain of yeast that's a little bit stronger. So there's one, I think it's called EC 1118. That is a strain of yeast that is really tough and can survive a lot of different environments. So you could switch up yeast. You could
You got to
just
be
try
careful
again
though.
with
You don't
different.
you don't want to you don't want to accidentally breed the next strain of deadly super
Yeah,
yeast that takes over the world. I mean, that's we've all seen.
that's what we're
uh
avoiding.
we've all seen the, what is it, Last of Us, right? We don't need that. We don't
Yeah,
need
what
the
is?
mead monsters.
Yeah, dude, yeah, that show's terrifying. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the basics. Today we're going to get into primary. Like I said, primary fermentation lasts a couple weeks. I might just do like a behind the scenes video for having the mead go from primary to secondary, so people can just follow along and see what that's like. And then in a couple months, once the mead is sat for a while and aged for a little bit, and it's kind of cleared out on its own, then we'll make another episode where we talk about like the bottling process and all of that. And we'll give it a taste and see what it tastes like.
So primary fermentation, let's just break it down again. Primary fermentation is your honey, your water, your yeast, and then your flavor additives.
Mhm.
Or and I should say some of your flavor additives, because there is also a process at which you'll add additional flavorings at a later date, right?
Yeah. So there's a couple, the big thing is back sweetening.
Mm.
Back sweetening is roughly 1/2 pound of honey per gallon. And that just brings some sweetness back to the mead. When you finish with primary, if you taste your mead at the end of primary fermentation, especially if it's just honey and it's just a traditional mead, it's going to be kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say bitter, but it won't be sweet. It'll be very
Mm-hmm.
dry. And to get some of that sweetness back, you add some honey close to bottling that kind of just brings your sweetness back.
Now, do you know, and I guess part of this is, do we modern humans know if the older mead recipes included things like back sweetening and included a lot of exotic ingredients, or did they, from what we know, were the recipes relatively simple?
Relatively simple. I have
Okay.
a book called, oh gosh, Welcome Mead.
Mm.
And it is a book with a bunch of medieval recipes that they found in some manuscript library that they just like collected and published in a book. And you can go through it, and not a lot of the recipes sound or look very intriguing, but that could be another fun episode, trying to pull one from that medieval book and just kind of see what it's
Yeah,
like.
yeah, yeah.
But I don't recall back sweetening or anything like that in that one.
I mean, we kind of take it for granted, but before the discovery of sugarcane and the, you know, massive production of sugarcane in the Caribbean, largely using slave labor that happened in the 15th, 16th centuries, honey was the primary source of sweetness for most people, at least in medieval Europe, where, you know, this podcast covered a lot of material inspired by medieval Europe and related legends. And so it's not surprising that honey would have been consumed in multiple forms, including in the form of alcoholic mead. I don't have a monologue here. Oh, John, I saw your shirt and I said John, but Sean is back in frame. Are we ready to do some pouring, some mixing?
Yeah, so apologies. I was just getting my funnel, getting it all ready. Behind the scenes, before we started recording, the big thing that I did was sanitize everything you're going to touch, or anything that your ingredients will touch needs to be sanitized beforehand. So anything you see me working with, I'll be like off screen washing my hands a lot to make sure that there's no cross contamination. One thing that I don't do that a lot of other people do that you'll see is people that will kind of boil or heat their must to also try to get rid of some contaminants that might be in there, like wild yeast or anything like that. I don't do that. And I've personally never had a batch that has been, outside of my first ever batch, that was just garbage. It was so bad. Ever since then, I mean, I haven't heated my must and I haven't come across any stinkers. They've all been pretty good.
Are you
So
are you familiar with any recipes that call for wild yeast?
no,
No.
no. And I think it's, if you're going to make yeast or make mead, you don't want wild yeast because it's unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
With the strains that I'm going to use and that I have used, you know, you're going to get a consistent product like every time.
Mm-hmm.
Wild yeast, it might only ferment a little bit. It might stall. It might give off flavors to the mead.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole bunch of different reasons why you would prefer to not use a wild yeast.
So in sourdough bread making, of which I've dabbled, like many people during the beginning of COVID, I dabbled in sourdough bread making, but I've also taken a class that predated the pandemic. The idea there is that you keep your starter and you feed your starter with flour and water. And then anytime you want to make bread, you take a little bit of your starter and that is the base of your next loaf. And so it really the same colony of yeast keeps going and living. And you know, some people say, oh, this is a, you know, an 8-year-old starter. I think I even saw something about like decades old starters that people kind of pass down from generation to generation. Is there anything similar in mead making? Can you save the must from one batch of mead and keep it going into other ones? I think if you could, that might be how, you know, our early modern, or, you know, even beyond that, ancestors kind of took wild yeast and kind of cultivated it, at least for some degree of control over their recipes.
I'm
Pure
sure you
speculation.
could. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure they probably did and you probably could, but it's not really necessary because someone's already done all of that work to give you like a consistent strain.
Yeah.
And the yeast packets are relatively cheap, and one packet makes 1 to 5 gallons. So, you know, I mean, if you want, I don't. It just seems, because then you, like, there are times where I don't have mead going, and then I feel like it would be a hassle to be constantly, you'd have to like keep mead going pretty regularly to
Yeah.
maintain a strain like that. But
Well, that was one of my
I
issues with
don't,
the sourdough bread making, is that you got to really make bread a lot in order to
yeah,
justify the continued feeding and maintenance of your
keeping your
starter.
own strain.
Yeah, and then you put it in the freezer when you leave for a week on vacation. You come back, you got to get it going
Mhm.
again, and yeah, I it was getting, because the first time I did it, actually, let me see, I've only ever made sourdough using starter that I got from a wild yeast. And some of the books that I was reading said literally like put your flour and your water in the bowl and then just walk around outside and let and let the stuff get in. And then they're like, it's gonna be funky for a while. And it really was. It smelled weird. But eventually you start getting that slight kind of tang when you know it's like you got the right strain of yeast. And then I think it was the lactobacillus or whatever it was. And then I got my sourdough and I got a decent rise out of it. And yeah, it started off weird and funky, but it ended with some pretty halfway acceptable, somewhat decent sourdough. Not saying you should do that.
Yeah, I will say funky mead, I don't think would taste very good. So if you're gonna make mead, I wouldn't use a wild strain. I would go to your homebrew store and find a strain there. If you would like to get into mead making, we'll do this quick before we get into the process. I started a couple years ago using Craft a Brew. That's a company that specializes in kits. So if you would like to get into beer making, wine making, or mead, they have their own kit for mead, and they'll send you pretty much everything you need to make a 1 gallon batch without the honey. So the honey you have to supply, it's pretty expensive. This is 3 pounds. And if I were to go to like a farmer's market, this would be pretty expensive to get 3 pounds. It'd probably be like $45 minimum.
That's a lot. It's a
for
lot.
3 pounds of honey. But I go to John's Homebrew and Wine, and I get it there for, I think it was like 8 something a pound. So it's like almost half the price of going to a farmer's market and getting good stuff. You really want raw, unfiltered honey. That's the goal. If you get stuff that's really processed, you're just not going to get as good of a product. So you want stuff, this is unfiltered. You get chunks of stuff every once in a while. It's from a local farm. So I know it's good.
The next step is you have to start beekeeping.
Trust me. Getting a house. That's
there we go. There we go.
On my list. I need my own apiary.
So one quick thing is, I don't know if we've ever talked about this just randomly, but I've toured a mead production facility for where the city where I live is kind of a mead center, at least the mead center of Michigan. A lot of places around here make mead. And one of them was a client when I worked at a company that sold bar trivia. And I toured their production site, and they had dozens of 40-gallon barrels of honey. And I think they were importing it from Guatemala, maybe. It was in Central America. And I don't know the price per pound. But it seems like as the most expensive ingredient, the honey, if you can figure out, a way to economize that, it could really
That's why
groundbreaker.
That's why when you go to a meadery or go to Total Wine or someplace like that and you buy a bottle of mead. So I have this is Opagard Meadery. And this is Dragon's Blood. This is blackberry, blueberry, raspberry mead. This is one of the best meads I've ever had in my life. I go to Renaissance fairs in Washington, the Washington Ren Fair. Opagard Meadery, John is his name. He's the one that creates all of the mead for the Ren Fair in Washington. And I believe he also does the Oregon Fair. But that bottle alone is like $40.
Yeah.
For that. It can be expensive, but I mean, I will gladly spend the money on that bottle of mead right there. It is phenomenal.
I mean, you go to the Michigan Renaissance Festival, and everybody gets their big, cups of beer and whatnot, and you order a mead. First of all, you're going to get a tiny glass
Like
of
a
mead.
4-ounce thing.
Yeah, and you're paying like probably double on a per ounce basis or whatever it is. And you can get some good stuff. To be quite frank, I really think the Michigan Renaissance Festival is probably underutilizing the local mead producers in the area. And maybe there's been some attempts there or whatnot, but like, as somebody who's just here's disclaimer: I don't drink a lot. Very rarely. I try your mead when it's available, and it's always very good. But like, that's the type of thing where I would shell out for a mead tasting or something like that at the Michigan Renaissance Festival. So if anybody happens upon this episode, Michigan Renaissance Festival people or Brewers Guild members or Mead Brewers Guild members, whatever it is, set that up with the Michigan Renaissance Festival. It would be a great way to spend some time there. Anyway, rant over. Sean, let's do it.
Yeah, so we are using the base mead from the Elder Scrolls Cookbook. And they make, says it's going to make a half gallon of mead. I don't like that much headspace or empty space in my demijohn or carboy or jar, whatever I'm using. So I'm going to make a full gallon. So that's kind of switched up my ingredients. I'm going to add a little bit more than they're recommending. They recommend at least 3 months of fermenting before you drink and bottle. If you want to wait longer, that's how you can clear it out a little bit more, your mead. If you don't wait long enough, it'll be cloudy and you'll have like bits of dead yeast, active yeast, just floaty things. You got to wait for all of that to kind of fall to the bottom.
Really
And
get
then
your
you're,
microbiome going with
yeah,
that. Yeah.
then you're ready to bottle at that point. So Sam and I are going
Obvi-
to,
Obvious question here, but when you go to bottle, you pipe from the top, right? Leave all that sediment at the bottom.
yeah, you siphon it out. Yeah. Yep. Which I was doing before we recorded. So if you notice at the beginning of the episode, I had some sweat on my bald head that was
That,
kind of
that's
dripping.
siphon sweat, people. That's
Yeah.
siphon sweat.
So I bottled 3 gallons. I came out with like 10 beer bottles, 8 or 9 375 milliliter bottles, and then like 3 wine bottles. So I have a lot of mead currently. And then, like I
And
said, you've got your own pour that you kind of leave out for yourself while you're doing the bottling.
and then once you bottle it, shelf life is basically forever. Does mead change
Yeah, the
over time?
longer you age it, the different flavor profile you're going to get. So one thing you can do, if you have a bunch of little beer bottles like I do, you could drink one right away, kind of get a feel for it, and then put the other ones in a cold, dark place for a while, and then try them again, see how it changes. But yeah, aging it does give it a different flavor profile.
And you said cold, dark place, so similar to beer, if it's exposed to sunlight, it will alter the flavor in a negative way.
Yeah, especially if you have a clear bottle like I do. But yeah, so Sam and I, as we're recording, we're probably going to be pausing every once in a while because it's going to take me time to like mix up the yeast or the must with the honey and water. And you don't want to just sit here and watch me shake a jug around while I combine the honey and water. That takes a little bit of time. So I think this is a good place to do our first pause. And I am going to, while we're paused, I'm going to mix up my 3 pounds of honey. I personally, I do like 3 pounds per gallon. That's my ratio. And at the end of fermentation, that usually makes a mead around 12-ish%. So we'll pause here. And
12%
I'm going,
alcohol.
yeah.
By volume.
Yep.
Got it.
And I'm going to make this must right now. That's what I'm going to be doing during our timeout. Here is a must mixing update.
Look at that must.
I'm just going to do this for a long time until
You know,
the honey is mixed into the water. And we'll pause here again and pick up in hopefully 5 minutes.
every time we resume, you're going to be sweatier and sweatier and sweatier.
So I lied a little bit about my order of operations and how I was going to prepare everything. The yeast, once you rehydrate it, needs to sit for 20 minutes. So I'm going to do that now while Sam and I get everything else behind the scenes ready to go. And here is our must so far. This is what we're mixing.
Looks a little frothy.
Yep, the honey and spring water. Here I have 2 ounces of water in my, this is what a yeast packet looks like. Lauven,
71B, that's the strain.
Yep, that's the strain that I use. D47 is another one you can get. And like I said earlier, EC1118. They all ferment differently. They all give a slightly different flavor profile. So I would highly recommend going to your homebrew store, like I do, and asking questions. The people that run homebrew stores are generally very knowledgeable and can give you a lot of help in your fermentation process. So here, and I'm going to kind of hold it right in front of the camera so you can see what dry yeast looks like. So they look like little balls when you kind of put them in there. So that's the dried yeast going into the 2 ounces of water. And when you do that, it really does smell like bread initially. So this is what it's going to sit and look like for 20 minutes. And then we'll come back and we will have a few more steps. We're going to walk through a couple steps now. The first one is, how do you tell how much alcohol you have? Now, I kind of gave you my guesstimate a little bit ago with 3 pounds of honey, usually coming out to around 12%. That's just what I found by getting my readings across multiple different meads that I've made, and it's going to vary. So if you put a lot of fruit into your primary fermentation, you're going to have a lot more sugar for your yeast to eat. So there's ways to calculate it specific, like to a science. I don't do that. I just take the measurement of my must, which is the honey and water combo, and that's what I use to determine sugar. So if I put, like the one I showed earlier had all the cranberries in there, that's in primary fermentation. That's going to end up being a little bit higher because there's more sugar content from the cranberries as well. So I'm not going to know exactly how much alcohol is in my cranberry mead, but it's going to be at least probably 12%. It's probably going to be a little bit higher than that.
So the more sugar, the more alcohol, because that's what the yeast is feeding on. Does it also take longer to reach the full fermentation stage?
I mean, you pay attention to the airlock, and that's kind of what you gauge to see how far along it is.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, there's not that much of a difference in sugar content. So it'll still probably be around 2 to 3 weeks for primary fermentation. Yeah. So what we're going to do now, without spilling, I'm going to take our must. This is the honey water combo. I'm going to pour it into our cylinder. I could use a funnel, but
look at that skill. Not a drop.
I'm feeling dangerous.
Not a drop wasted.
And anything you put into the cylinder, this is all sanitized, so I could feasibly just dump it right back in.
Can we get a slight camera angle change just to show everybody the process here? There we go. So that's the full cylinder of the must. And in goes
7 ounces. This is called a hydrometer. So what I'm looking for is right here. So this tells me the standard gravity. You can't really see, but there's a bunch of little markings right there. This tells me how much sugar is in. I might have to take a little bit out. Yep, I overfilled.
Spoke too soon.
Which is okay, because it just goes straight back into the rest of the meat anyway. Okay. So then it'll float. And this batch, the standard gravity, which is the first measurement we take, is 1.12.
1.12 standard gravity.
So what you do now, I have a notebook, and I would write this in my notebook so I can keep track of all my information. Thank you, Tammy Messner, for my Mead notebook. So you take your standard gravity, you write it down, and then at the end of fermentation, before you back sweeten, because then you're adding more sugar to it, when fermentation is complete, you get another reading. And then honestly, I just go into my phone and I plug in the two standard gravity and then final gravity. And then it tells you what your alcohol percentage is. So if you don't get this measurement now, before you add the yeast, you're never going to know what your real alcohol content is. So that's why that is very important to do that first. So put that right there. So this is going to go straight back in with the rest. And so far, we have followed every step, minus a couple extra scientific steps, or plus a couple of scientific steps.
Quick question on the gravity measure. What's the range of standard gravities that you would expect for the meat that you make?
I usually come right around that 1.1, 1.12. That's usually kind of where I end up. You can use less sugar, like less honey in your mead, and you're just going to get a lower alcohol content. And usually when you back sweeten anyway, that's where you get your sweetness. That's where you get your flavor of the honey. If you just ferment honey and drink it a couple months later, it might not taste very good. But yeah, so that's everything we followed is from that first mead option in the Elder Scrolls. Then in the Elder Scrolls Cookbook. From there, they give you other recipes or different meads you can make. And that all just depends on the different ingredients that we're going to add. So for the juniper berry mead, we are going to add juniper berries, hibiscus, and yarrow.
So let's see, yarrow, that looks like petals or something of a flower. Yeah, I think yarrow is a flowering plant, right?
Yes, it looks a lot like the size and shape of lavender a little bit.
Okay.
It smells a little funky.
Vegetal aroma.
Mm-hmm. I mean, hibiscus, yeah. But juniper berries are very piney.
Yeah, juniper is it's an evergreen shrub, right?
Yeah. So now we have our mesh bag. This is just for ease of cleanup. When you could just throw everything into the liquid, but then it makes a little bit harder time when you're trying to put your racket, is what we call moving from one vessel to another. So when you're going from primary to secondary fermentation, you would rack it or siphon out all of your liquid from one jar and put it into another. So what I'm going to do is just dump all of our ingredients into our mesh bag. So that was 4 tablespoons juniper berry. I doubled everything from the cookbook. I believe we have 4 teaspoons of yarrow. And then 2 tablespoons of hibiscus. So this is all of the different ingredients you need for a 1 gallon batch. So if you're making half gallon, as the recipe states in the cookbook, you'd only have half as much of this, which really doesn't look like a whole lot. I mean, there's my head.
So there's the mesh bag isn't going to result in a slightly less flavored meat because it's soaking for so long that it's going to permeate the entire liquid. Yeah.
So it'll be in there for all of primary fermentation, and then I will probably take it out for secondary when I rack everything. And then whatever flavors come out of this is what we'll get. So we'll go from there. Now we're going to get it to the point where we're doing everything but add the yeast. So now we're going to move our must into our jar. This is what I'm going to use. It makes it a lot easier to get the mesh bag out because it's a wide mouth jar. And during fermentation, you get a lot of bubbles. And I'm going to try to document as we go over the next couple months. And I'll post videos, pictures to our, Alexa, stop. our yeast is done.
Oh,
So I'm going to post videos and pictures during the whole process to just update people if you're interested in how our juniper berry mead is going. But now we're going to add our must to our fermentation vessel.
what are the earlier you listed off a couple different names for what I'm assuming are vessels. What are the two types of vessel that you have here? Wide mouth jar, is there a special name for that?
I don't know. I've heard the terms demijohn be
Mm,
used. Carboy is another term. For the jar, I just call it a jar. I don't know if
jar.
there's a,
It's jar.
I don't know if there's a special term for it or not. But
Not
we'll
to be
get
confused with that
this
movie starring Kate Blanchett called Tar.
tar, yeah, where she's a conductor, right?
Yeah.
So we have a little bit left over that's not going to fit, but that's okay because the gravity is going to be the same regardless. And now that we have our yeast that is done, this is what it looks like.
That
It
really has that
has,
done much since you mixed it and you activated
yeah.
it?
So initially, if you could tell when I was pouring it, there were a bunch of little balls, basically. That's what the yeast looked like. Now it looks like a slurry where there's no solid pieces that I can really see. There's some on the sides right there.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, it has become kind of looks like mud, a little bit like clay, kind of. So we're just going to dump it right in. And you can see, give you another update. I'll use the hydrometer to kind of push things around a little bit. You can see all that cloudiness kind of mixing in there. But that's the yeast. And we're going to push that bag down a little bit. Okay.
There's no use in trying to weight down the bag, right? It'll still permeate throughout the water.
Oh yeah, it'll still do its job, yeah. And every once a day, well, not really, because you don't want to open it up the vessel as much,
Mm-hmm.
but feasibly you could periodically open it back up and push it back down. Um, once it's in primary, I try to be pretty hands off and just kind of let it go until I'm ready to transition to secondary fermentation. But yeah, this is kind of where we're at. There's one last thing that I need to do before we kind of wrap it up for this part of it anyway, and that's to add the yeast nutrient. So there's not enough nutrients in honey to help the yeast survive. It needs a little bit more, and you can buy, it's just called yeast nutrient that you add, and then just helps the honey be successful. So the last couple things we need to do is add the nutrient, but I'm not going to do that now because it's late for Sam, and I want him to be able to go to bed. So we have our lid for the jar, has a little hole on top. We have an airlock that we put into the hole. And to be as sanitary as possible, some people use the sanitizer that you use to sanitize all of your equipment. I use vodka
Hmm.
in mine. To me, I know it's a,
Pure ethyl alcohol.
yeah. So
yeah.
one thing you'll notice if you start to make meat at home, you'll get a lot of fruit flies attracted to this. And there's holes at the top of this airlock that are just big enough for fruit flies to get in. And I like to make sure that I have a very sterile environment.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's it. So now, after I add my yeast nutrient, this
Well,
is going to sit for
real quick on the airlock. The idea is that the fermentation process produces a lot of carbon dioxide, and if you don't let it escape, you could get a shattered jar,
Oh yeah.
mead, must everywhere. And then the airlock, so it allows the carbon dioxide to escape gradually. and it prevents kind of pollution, right? So you don't want random microbes and dust and pollens and things like that flowing back through an open top of a jar. You don't want fruit flies getting in, so the airlock prevents all that.
Yeah, 100%. Now we have an enclosed environment where eventually any oxygen that's in here in this small amount of headspace
Mm-hmm.
is going to be pushed out by the carbon dioxide. And then only CO2 is going to be coming out the top up here. And that's what you'll see when it starts to bubble. And
So
I'll try
really,
to get it.
you're contributing to global warming.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But I'll try to get a video of the bubbles because I'd say probably tomorrow morning it'll be a little bubbly. And then by tomorrow night, it should be a pretty active ferment. So we should see a lot of bubbles starting to come out. But
Fine.
that's me.
All right.
It's pretty straightforward. So if people are interested in doing it on their own, I highly recommend the Craft to Brew kit. You gives, like I said, gives you everything you need but the honey. And then, yeah, it's just a lot of trial and error. Like I said, the first batch I ever made was god awful, but now I feel like I'm producing stuff that's drinkable. So,
I mean, I've had it and it's phenomenal. I've had Sean's mead. I've also had some other local, very artisanal meads, very high, well-regarded meads, and Sean's mead is delicious. In fact, I kind of resent it whenever we have a family get together and the mead gets open because that means I have to share with a bunch of other people.
yes. And until I get my liquor license in the state of Washington, I cannot sell my mead. So it's just a lot of me getting high on my own supply, as the saying goes.
That reminds me of the Ron Swanson quote. This is as complicated as the economy should be. I would like to buy some apples. Here are your apples. Thank you.
But that's our mead episode. We will keep in touch with some updates as
This
we
is
go.
part one. Part one.
Part one. Part two coming in at least a minimum of 3 months. So hopefully the podcast exists for.
Yeah. Come on, Rings of Power Season 2. Critical Role.
If you have any questions on the mead making process, I am an amateur. I'm not a professional, but I have gathered some of my information that I do know from professionals. So if you have questions about the process, I would be happy to try to answer. If you want to know a little bit more about what I've done that I wasn't very clear about on this episode, please feel free to reach out to me or us. Otherwise, this has been Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things, episode 68. Our next episode, still a surprise for you until we get it recorded and in the can, because then I'll know it's real. We're doing that next week. It'll probably be a two-parter. And then Sam and I got to figure out what the hell we want to do after that. So
any suggestions, more than open to it. You know, I don't have anything as cool as mead making. Like I said, at one point I was a sourdough bread maker, but that would be an incredibly boring episode because you think waiting 20 minutes for yeast to activate is boring. You should try waiting 4 days.
well, you can follow us on Facebook, Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. We have a Facebook group, Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things podcast, where we interact with people with polls and things. So if Sam and I are ever trying to figure out what the hell we want to do next, we'll sometimes post options and let people help us decide. You can send us emails, elvesringsandnerdythings@gmail.com.
Like, subscribe to this podcast, share it with your friends. This is our second video episode ever. The YouTube page could use some subscriptions. Thank you to those who have subscribed and are watching our videos. Throw some comments on there. It helps other people discover us. Quick little aside. Earlier today, Sean, your parents were here visiting, and I wanted to show them the episode that we previously recorded where we had our fantasy cook-off or bake-off, whatever you want to call it. Not that it was a contest. And it took a lot of typing to find our episode, to find our podcast on YouTube. There's a lot of other stuff out there competing. So help us out with the algorithm. Give us some likes, subscribes, and shares, and you'll get more of this fantasy content involving Sean from his kitchen and me from my dingy basement.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.